In the last video, we were talking about the concept of nature versus nurture. And just to review briefly, we said that nature is all about those characteristics that are inherited characteristics. Inherited, they're the characteristics you get from your genes, which are inherited from your parents. And we said that in general, people tend to interpret these kinds of characteristics as fixed characteristics, things that are in general not changeable. And then on the other side, we're talking about nurture as basically after you get your genetic inheritance, it's all the stuff that happens to you from that point on. So the stuff that's going on around you, we call that the environment. Environment, the stuff that goes on around you. And of course, in contrast to nature, we said that people tend to view characteristics that you get from your environment as things that are more changeable. And then we also talked about how this tends to be seen as a sort of battle between nature versus nurture, where people will say that, or claim that a psychological characteristic is entirely due to nature or entirely due to nurture. At least historically, it's been treated that way. So the question that I want to look at now is, can we challenge ourselves to come up with some examples of things that are entirely due to nature or entirely due to nurture? And I don't just mean any characteristic, but specifically a psychological characteristic. So for example, we can see that your eye color or your hair color comes from your genes. But is there some way that a person thinks or behaves where we can point at that and say they're doing that because of their genes? So I think one of the clearest examples of this for the nature side of this concept is a condition called Huntington's disease. And so in Huntington's disease, what's going on is you have a defective gene. So in a normal individual, this gene would provide the instructions to tell your cells how to construct a particular type of protein that your body uses. But in this case, the gene is defective. Now, sometimes with defective genes, the instructions are all messed up and they won't produce anything. In this case, they produce the protein, but the protein is also defective. So the defective genes result in a defective protein. And the result of this is it doesn't become apparent for potentially years, even decades into the person's life. Usually somewhere around their 30s or 40s, the effects of this defective protein start to accumulate and start to become apparent. And what the defective protein does, and we don't have to get into the details of this, but what it does is it is damaging to certain cells, certain types of brain cells. So the end result of this is brain damage. And the exact nature of the brain damage and the exact symptoms can vary from person to person, but some of the most common symptoms in Huntington's disease are things like the person may exhibit apathy. They may have trouble being interested in behaviors that they would normally engage in with no problem. Similarly, they may have trouble initiating actions. So if you can manage to get them started on something, they may do just fine with that behavior, but they may have a lot of trouble getting themselves to start that action. And this has to do with the specific cells that are damaged in the brain that normally control these sorts of things, helping you to initiate action. Also, some of the cells that are damaged often have something to do with control of movement in the body. So a very common symptom in Huntington's is that the person ends up exhibiting involuntary movements, strange random movements of their body. And so if we go back up and we compare Huntington's disease with our description of a characteristic that comes from nature, how well does this line up? Well, it is a defective gene that you inherit from your parents. So yeah, it's inherited, it's a gene, and this is something that is pretty much fixed. If you get this gene, it really doesn't matter what kind of diet you eat, if you reduce your stress levels, whether you're in a nurturing environment, none of that really matters so much. You're going to have this defective protein. It's going to be damaging to your brain, and you're going to exhibit some symptoms. So it is, we can say it's a fixed or not changeable characteristic that results from nature. Now, even here, I should mention, yes, the individual's going to get brain damage, and that's a fixed or inevitable outcome, but the exact nature and extent of the symptoms that they exhibit can actually be moderated by the environment. So sometimes the person may exhibit, more symptoms or a greater intensity of symptoms if they're sort of exacerbated by the right, or maybe I should say the wrong kind of environment. So I don't want to imply that there's no effective environment on the person's behavior, but certainly if we see the person having these involuntary movements, being apathetic, having trouble initiating actions, we can say that is because of the genes that they inherited from their parents, this fixed, relatively unchangeable characteristic that they got. Okay, so let's go over to the nurture side now and see, can we come up with an example of something a characteristic that you get entirely from your environment and doesn't come from your genes? And a real clear example of that we see everywhere is just the type of language that people speak. So if you grow up in an environment where people are speaking English, then you're going to end up speaking English. And if you grow up in an environment where people are speaking Japanese, then you're going to end up speaking Japanese. But there is no one would suggest that there's a Japanese language gene or an English language gene. So type of language seems to fit these criteria. It's something you get from your environment, from the stuff that's going on around you. And it is changeable in a sense that you could always pick up a new language later in life. Now, just as a side note, there is a reason that I specifically put type of language, because there's very good reasons to think that the fact that you speak a language to begin with is largely influenced by genetics. So this is actually a major battle that went on in psychology about whether language development was driven by genetic inheritance or whether it was more about the environment. And we'll talk more in detail about that, but there was very good evidence presented to say people have a very strong tendency to develop some kind of language, but the specific type of language is something that is determined by your environment. So it does seem like we can come up with some examples, at least, of things that we would be justified in saying this psychological characteristic is the result of nature, and this characteristic is the result of nurture. We can come up with at least some examples of that. But it turns out that most psychological characteristics aren't that simple, and the only way we can understand them is in terms of an interaction between both nature and nurture. So the idea is you get some particular set of genes that may tend to lead you to act a certain way. The way we often put this is it may give you a predisposition. So you may be predisposed to be more aggressive, or you may be predisposed perhaps to developing alcoholism. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to happen. And whether that thing happens is often a result of whether a second thing then happens in the environment. So in other words, you have to both have the right gene and have the right things happen to you as you go through life, and then with a combination, an interaction of those two things, you will develop the particular behavior or mental characteristic that we're talking about. So I realize that might sound a bit abstract, so in the next video we're going to look at what I think is a real clear, concrete example of how this interaction between genes and the environment can take place.